You are listening to the Culture Reformation podcast, where we discuss on topics like doctrine and theology, marriage and singlehood, church leadership, and many more. We are glad that you have tuned in and hope that you be blessed as you listen. Here's the podcast.
Hi everybody, it is such a great joy to be with you guys once again. I'm Matson Poruthar, your host for Culture Reformation podcast. And today we are going to be touching a really crucial topic when it comes to Christian faith. And that is the question that we all face when we are witnessing to our unbeliever friends. And that's, did Jesus rise from the dead? To do that, we have a very special guest with us, and his name is Asher John. Asher John is a Bangalore-based data science professional with an academic background in statistics. He co-founded the Carpenter's Desk as a platform to identify, address, and refute the objections to Christian faith. So it's going to be exciting. He's published a couple of articles in Christian magazines and also in secular print like Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy's annual journal, and also in news media platforms like First Post and Boom Live. So that's a mouthful, and I am super excited to have him on the show right now. Hi Asher, why don't you go ahead and greet our audience and say how you feel about this podcast?
Hey, hi Matt. It's a privilege to be and a pleasure to be on your podcast. It's fine if I call you Matt, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yes.
Yeah. So yes, I've been actually following this Culture Reformation podcast, and I'm a person who strongly believes that we are seeing this sort of a revolution in terms of the media that we use, and this is a very culturally relevant form of doing both evangelism, even apologetics. And I'm really glad that this endeavor that you have started, and it's a pleasure to be with you on today.
It's a pleasure to have you, Asher. So without further ado, Asher, why don't you go ahead and speak to us, lay the case in front of us. How can you justify the resurrection of Christ from the dead, the physical resurrection of Christ from the dead?
Yes, Matt. So basically, when you're talking about the resurrection of Jesus, sometimes it's often we are embarrassed to talk about this. But before moving any further, I want to state upfront that we know that the resurrection is at the very heart of Christianity, and there's a big distinction between Christianity and other world religions. That Christianity has a null hypothesis, a default hypothesis that can be either verified or falsified. Now, what do I mean by that? If the resurrection is a myth, then Christianity is the greatest lie ever told. But if it is true, then it is exclusively true. So that is why we have to look at this case. When I said that distinction between other religions, you look at religions like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and all of these religions, and there's something there's a clear distinction that you can see, that none of the other world religions, they don't give you an hypothesis that can either be verified or falsified, on which it stands. But Christianity gives you that. Christianity stands on an historical event, which, if true, would mean that Christianity is true. And this goes back to Paul writing around AD 50, which is extremely close to the time of the alleged event. He's writing in a public letter to Corinth that if Christianity did not, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then Christianity is false. He says that basically our preaching is in vain, and so is your faith. So this is a big distinction. You consider Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism, they're all based on private revelation. One person has an angelic encounter or a private enlightenment in case of Buddha, or in case of Hinduism. You look at the Vedas, they were all sayings that they got when they were completely immersed in meditation. So these are all private enlightenments or private angelic encounter that cannot be verified. But on the other hand, in Christianity, you have this man who does his ministry in public for 3 years. He publicly claims that he will die and come back to life, and then he comes back to life, leaves public eyewitnesses, and therefore he gives this as matter of public record. And this is what Bart Ehrman, who is an atheist New Testament historian, he calls the Gospels a matter of public record. They come in the genre of ancient biographies. So that is a big distinction that you can already see between other worldviews and Christianity, that it gives you a testable hypothesis. Now, when you're coming to the resurrection, we'll obviously be taking up very specific questions later on. But while I'm putting this case, there are a couple of facts that are agreed upon by majority of scholars, be it atheist New Testament scholars or historians, from Jewish background, from whatever background, faith background they have. They all agree upon a few historical facts about Jesus. They may not, for example, atheist historians, they may not agree that Jesus literally rose from the dead, but they will agree upon a few facts. And it was the American historian Gary Habermas who actually identified them and called them the minimal facts. First, he identified 12 facts, and then he even cut it down and said, well, you know what, I just need 6 of them. And there are 2 criteria for these facts. Basically that these facts should be independently attested and from various sources. It should have multiple, let's say, methods to arrive at these particular facts, which we will definitely look in detail. And the second thing is that they should have a scholarly consensus. For a fact to be selected as a minimal fact, there should be 90 percentile plus of actual historians today, irrespective of their faith background, attesting that these things occurred. So what are these facts? I'll just name the most important ones which I would use for the case for the resurrection. Jesus' death on a Roman cross. This is a fact that is attested by all, basically, I would say virtually all of the New Testament historians who are out there today. They all attest that Jesus died through the method of Roman crucifixion. And then you have the discovery of the empty tomb, that 3 days later, the tomb in which Jesus was laid was found to be empty. Then the third fact is the early eyewitness claims of seeing and experiencing the risen Lord. Notice that I'm not saying that Jesus rose from the dead here, the third fact, but there were early eyewitness claims of seeing or experiencing the risen Lord. And then you have fact number 4, the conversion of people who stood as enemies to this message, like Saul of Tarsus and James, the brother of Jesus. These 2 characters opposed the message, but then you have these sort of enemies to this message who embrace the faith, and we know what they accomplish for this message. So you have this enemy attestation to this faith, as historians call it. And then you have the last fact that I would use is the astonishing rise of the Christian movement in the 1st century. Atheist sociologist Rodney Stark, perhaps he has the best treatment by a sociologist on early Christianity. He calculates the rise of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd century, and he notes that Christianity rose at an alarming rate of 40% per decade. So sometimes we hear popular theories, that Christianity had political power, that Rome used that power to spread Christianity. But notice that the political power only comes in after AD 280. So for the first 2 centuries, through persecution, through the fire of persecution, you see this movement spreading through the Judean world and then even shaking up the Greco-Roman world at an alarming rate of 40% per decade. That's a very steep rise that you can see. So this astonishing rise of the Christian movement. And N.T. Wright, a British historian, he says, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. So you have these 5 facts that I mentioned. I'll repeat that. Jesus died on the Roman cross, the discovery of the empty tomb, early eyewitness claims. I mean, we can see whether they actually saw the risen Lord, but they claimed to have seen the risen Lord. And then you have the conversion of Saul of Tarsus and James, the brother of Jesus, and then the astonishing rise of the Christian movement in the 1st century. So once you have this historical data, the historical method is such that it looks for the hypothesis that best fits this data. Now, you must notice this. 2000 years have gone by, but there is so much academic curiosity around this particular event that these naturalistic scholars, or who come from with a naturalistic bias, but they're skeptics basically, but they're academics, they are putting forward theories to explain what exactly happened here. That should itself, kind of invoke in us what exactly is going on. There is no curiosity around the historicity of Muhammad, or things that Buddha did, as much as it is there for this particular event. What Dale Allison, the New Testament historian, calls the resurrection of Jesus is the prized puzzle, even 2000 years gone by, but it is still the prized puzzle of New Testament research. But whenever I speak on this particular topic, I actually mention to make it a little interesting, I take a very detective approach, or what I call the Sherlock Holmes method. So if you actually like the Sherlock Holmes detective series, you will notice that Sherlock Holmes often says this to Watson. He repeats this in his in his conversation with Watson. You can find this particular statement in various forms in the Arthur Conan Doyle's different books on Sherlock Holmes. He says this: it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts. So if you have any bias heading to this conversation regarding the resurrection of Jesus, you should not come with that bias, or that preconceived notions about certain things. But you should look at the data first, and then you should decide the theory. And it should not be the other way, that you twist the data to suit your theories. That is the approach that we should take. And going ahead, we will actually look at some of those specific facts that I mentioned, and how these different hypotheses fare to the resurrection.
That's interesting. Well, I want to ask you a very important question, Asher, and that is the historical evidence, especially from the Christian community. We talk more from the gospel, the 4 accounts of the gospel where the resurrection is mentioned in detail. And but one thing about these 4 gospels is that they are different in their narrative style. This is the point that atheists make. So if it's a conflicting account, if all 4 of them are conflicting accounts, then how do you take this as an eligible way of presenting the argument for resurrection?
Yes, thanks, Matt. That's a really good question, and that is something that we often face. But here's an interesting thing, let me put it very simply. Because they conflict on these particular details, the Gospels, they conflict on these particular details, that is exactly why you can trust them. That might sound a little, oh wow, but let me just describe that for you here. When the historians, they actually try to validate any ancient event based on documents, they have a few set of criterions that they use. And one of the criteria is a criterion of dissimilarity. That, let's say I'm talking about Abraham Lincoln being shot dead, all right? You take multiple news reports of that particular event, and then you compare these reports, you will see that they, on the fundamental details, on the primary details, they all say the same thing. Basically, Lincoln was shot dead. But on the secondary details, they will differ. That basically on the descriptions of the person who killed him, or what Lincoln was doing at that moment, of where he was going, where he was heading. So there would be always differences in the secondary details. Just think about this: there's a terrorist attack, and then you are reading it in the newspaper the next day. You will see some secondary details differing: the number of people who died, the number of people who were injured, and all of that. Even today, when our information technologies are much better and much more precise than that era. So when historians apply this to particular historical event, if you have multiple documents saying exactly the same thing about all primary and secondary details, then it is most likely a lie. Then it is most likely that they came together and they devised this, they cleverly devised this particular, conspiracy. That's why Peter says in his second epistle that, when we came to you, we did not come with cleverly devised myths. We are witnesses. We are eyewitnesses of His Majesty, Peter writes in his epistle. So when you compare the Gospels, notice that they all agree upon the fundamental facts: that Jesus was killed by the Romans, that He was crucified, that 3 days later His tomb was found to be empty. They all agree that the first people who saw the risen Jesus were women. They agree that He appeared to His disciples and He appeared to His followers.
So these fundamental primary details are completely consistent with all the four gospels. What differ is, how many angels were there near the tomb, or one particular gospel doesn't even call them angels, calls them a man in white robe, and one says there were two men in white, or one angel sitting on the stone. And these are secondary details. If there is one person, there can obviously be two persons. And if you can actually work around it, there is also a way that you can actually solve the entire puzzle. But dissimilarity in and of itself is a criteria for authenticity. And one particular person whom maybe I'll leave for reference here is J. Warner Wallace. J. Warner Wallace, he was a cold case detective, in the US, and he's now a Christian apologist. And as a skeptic, when he decided, well, I'm going to look at the resurrection accounts, I'm going to look at the gospel accounts, he often tells this, that, I thought that they would all say the same thing, and therefore I could disprove it. But when I looked at it, basically it was actually qualifying the very basic requirement we use to investigate and come across evidence. So he says that basically if there is a murder or some cold case that have been closed and we are reopening it, and we call all the eyewitnesses and we take the details, if they are differing on the color of the shirt of the culprit or something like that, the secondary details always differ. But if the primary details are consistent, then the story is very authentic. So the criteria of dissimilarity, ironically, proves the resurrection of Jesus.
Wow, that was interesting. Now, we spoke about the Gospels. Can you share with us if there are any early non-Christian sources for the historical facts around the resurrection?
Right. Now, Matt, you already described the Gospels, but the stumbling block for the skeptic is not the Gospels, even when you consider from the Christian sources. It is something that, do you want me to go on that a little before coming on the non-Christian sources?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead, Asher.
Yes. So, the actual stumbling block for the skeptic is a creed that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15. And that is, because the Gospels, they tried to push it to AD 60s and 70s, which is still very close. But the creed that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15, so it basically talks about his death, his burial, his resurrection according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, and then he appeared also to me. This particular creed that Paul quotes is not his own writing. If you notice the first verse of 1 Corinthians 15, he says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received," which means that he's not writing that text, he actually received that text. And all major historians date this particular creed before AD 40. That is extremely close. That is extremely close to the particular event. That is which means that there was already a creed in circulation, which is not originating from Paul, but Paul is saying that I received this, and I'm just the textual critics, they compare the language of that creed with Paul's writing and the structure of that creed, and they can pinpoint it and say that, well, this is not Paul's writing, this is not Pauline. So it is coming from an outside source which already existed. And the New Testament historian James Dunn, for instance, he was a brilliant scholar who just passed away a few months ago. He dates this particular creed to within 18 months of Jesus' death. Extremely close. And then you have Gerd Ludemann, who is an atheist historian, and in his book the Resurrection of Jesus, page 171 and 172, he says the elements in the tradition are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. The formation of the appearance of traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3 to 8 falls in the time between 30 and 33 AD. That is extremely close to the alleged event. So this is, while it is a Christian source, this is a public letter that was in circulation among Christians that Paul first wrote to the Corinthians, and this creed was already circulating way close to the resurrection. And even atheist historians, I just quoted Ludemann, but people like Bart Ehrman and several other agnostic New Testament scholars, they date it extremely close, within 3 to 5 years after the alleged death and resurrection of Jesus. Now, you talked about the non-Christian sources. Now, the point here is, Matt, that um, we're talking about the minimal facts. So, the minimal facts are those facts that are agreed upon by all scholars in this business, right? So when you're talking about the minimal facts, say the fact of Jesus' death on the cross. Now, Jesus' death on the cross, that was the first, that he was basically, he died on a Roman cross. Now, someone like John Dominic Crossan is again a atheist historian. He basically writes this. He says this on page 145 of his book, Jesus, a Revolutionary Biography. He says, Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Notice he's not a Christian. Then he says this, for if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after his crucifixion, we would still know about him from two authors not among his supporters. Their names are Flavius Josephus and Cornelius Tacitus. These are both first century sources who are not Christians, Tacitus being a Roman historian and Josephus being a first century Jewish historian. Both these sources, he says that just from these sources we can narrow down a couple of facts, and those facts are basically that Jesus died on the cross. And then you have the Roman governor Pliny the Younger. I can quote a couple of people here, but Pliny the Younger, his letter, which is around the early part of the 2nd century, or can be dated thus close to the resurrection. This is a very early source. In that letter, he writes about this particular movement, the Christian movement, and they are worshipping Jesus as God. And in his letter, it is implicit that the claims that the followers of Jesus were making. So the eyewitness claim, that particular minimal fact, is also explained from the non-Christian sources like Pliny the Younger. And then you have the case of Saul and James that I mentioned. That is also a minimal fact. Now, Saul and Saul of Tarsus, was later called Paul, and then James. Even these writings, they are not coming from the Gospels or the epistles about what happened to them, about their martyrdom. This is also coming from other sources. Basically, for Saul of Tarsus, or Paul, that he was beheaded for his faith by the order of the Roman Emperor Nero. This is coming from sources like Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp. These are extremely close sources, writing in the latter part of the 1st century or in the early part of the 2nd century. So these are sources that we can note for Paul of Tarsus, his conversion and his testimony that he lived out and he was willing to die for this particular claim. And similarly, even for James, you have James, the brother of Jesus, you have sources like Josephus, the 1st century historian. Then you have Clement of Alexandria. So these are all extra biblical sources that confirm to the minimal facts that I mentioned. So that is exactly the reason why, as I said, irrespective of faith backgrounds, these particular facts are accepted by 90 percentile plus of scholarship today.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so Asher, you've done a great job in making your case for the life and death and the empty tomb of Jesus Christ. And as a Christian, of course, you lean towards the resurrection of Christ. And you gave us a lot of explanation why you do so. But what about any other different kind of theories that try to explain the same historical data which you have? What about those theories?
Now, as I said, there are various theories across many years, across 2000 years, that have been put forward in academia to explain these facts without the resurrection. And all of them fall short by a huge margin to the resurrection hypothesis. And there are even weird theories, Matt, if you know. There are theories, just like I said, about the alien abduction theory. And then there is one theory called the twin brothers hypothesis, that basically Jesus had a twin brother who was not in Jerusalem during Jesus' time. After he died, this guy comes back to Jerusalem and he he learns that, well, you know what, his brother, his twin brother has died, and then he goes around claiming to be that Jesus. And such, I mean, these theories these are completely unfounded in history, but these are some theories that people have proposed to explain. So what are the rival theories, the major rival theories that have gained popularity in academia? And then I'll come to the most important one today, that majority of New Testament historians who are skeptics hold to. So I want to focus more on that particular theory. But before coming to that, we have the stolen body hypothesis, theories that claim that Christ's body was stolen. And then you have the swoon hypothesis, which is basically, or it's also called the apparent death theory, that Jesus actually did not die on the cross. Things like what Muslims say, because the Quran says that he kind of appeared to die. But just as I quoted a while ago, an atheist historian like John Dominic Crossan, he says that is one of the most, let's say, obvious facts about Jesus. Even if you completely eliminate all the Christian sources we have from the first century, we can deduce that he was actually killed by the Romans. So there is a swoon hypothesis that Jesus did not die on the cross. And the most important one that we must address is the hallucination hypothesis, that the early Christians were simply experiencing visual hallucinations. They were merely having this thing in their head. They were hallucinating the risen Jesus. So these are basically the alternative theories put forward, Matt.
Wow. Okay, one last question for the day, and I think this will be the nail on the coffin. Given that Jesus died on the cross, his tomb was empty, and the disciples believed that he was risen, and they proclaimed the gospel. And given all of this, if I was to say that, hey, hold on, just because the disciples believed that they saw Jesus risen from the dead, doesn't make it true, because even the jihadis, they believe and they give their lives for that belief, So just because the disciples were consistent to the point of even death, doesn't make their belief true. So how do you kind of justify that, Asher?
Well, that's a really good question, because this is something that I hear all the time. Now, here's the interesting thing, that when it comes to the early disciples, we know that all of them were persecuted. And when it comes to Paul, James, and James, the disciple, James, the brother of Jesus, and a couple of those, Peter, we have good, solid historical evidence, even outside the Christian sources, or basically the Gospels and the epistles, even outside the biblical sources, that they had to endure martyrdom. Now, here's the thing, Matt, that when jihadis, they die for their beliefs, they are dying for something that they heard and they believed to be true. But in the case of the disciples, they did not hear and believe and were genuine in their conviction, and they died for their faith. That's not the case with the earliest apostles. They died for what they knew was either true or false. They died for what they knew that was either correct or false, because they claimed to be the direct eyewitnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, both in the epistles and otherwise. We know that they were claiming to be direct eyewitnesses to. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that I saw the risen Lord. Peter says in his second letter that I saw the risen Lord. So they were dying for what they knew to be either true or false. And people don't die for what they know is false. They may believe something based on what they heard, and they maybe brainwashed to think that was not the case with disciples. They were dying for something that was first hand or direct eyewitness report, so to speak, Matt.
I would have loved to continue this discussion because it's so interesting, but we'll have to bring it to an end. Asher, before we close, would you like to give any closing remarks?
Well, yes. I mean, just one particular remark that I would quickly give is that both if you're a Christian or a non-Christian, right, particular discussion that we had is very relevant, because if Jesus did actually rise from the dead, that means there is hope for humanity. There is so much of, this is not just to prove something that, okay, not to get a one let's say, upmanship that, what, our religion is true and therefore we rock. That's not what we are saying, right? If this even actually happened in history, then that says something about that person. And if you look at one of the reports, one of the eyewitness reports about Jesus, which was documented by his disciple John, he says that when Jesus was asked to show what by what authority do you do these things, he said that, destroy this temple and I will build it up in 3 days. So that was the confirmation that he gave, that my resurrection, he was actually talking about his body, that he will rise again in 3 days. And that was the proof that he said, I can give it and I will prove this for the authority that I have. And if the resurrection is true, then everything makes sense in retrospective. The death on the cross and the salvation, all of that makes sense. You have different folks in all of history who have claimed to be godmen or gods and all of that, but none of them said that, I'll give you a proof. I will prove my claims. Buddha did not claim it. With all due respect, Muhammad did not claim it. No one claimed it. But Jesus said that he will rise from the dead, and he made some big claims about the human nature, about who we are, what we are intended to be. You must read the Gospels to know all of that. But he said that, I will give you a proof as well. He made a very radical claim that he would come back from life, and he proved it. That's where the evidence leads us to. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Asher. That was truly a blessing to talk to you, and I'm sure that all those who have heard us can testify to that. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the podcast. Do subscribe to our channel and like and share this video so the word goes out. Thank you so much once again, Asher. God bless you all for tuning in. Take care.